Um,
All right.
Start.
Wonderful.
All right. Hi, this is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for another segment of Dispatches Conversation Lockdown. Joining us today is a dear friend, a writer, researcher, and visual storyteller, Preethi Nallu. She's here to discuss with us the meaning of what it means to work in the aftermath of COVID, the vulnerabilities of single people living on their own away from home, the new encounters, new ways to think about journalism, but also the situations of migrant laborers in both Lebanon and India, where she's done extensive reporting. Preeti, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to it, and I just heard you, and I see that there's quite a bit of ground to cover. So I haven't prepared notes as much. I just wanted to sort of catch up and talk to you about what's been going on in my neck of the woods. So yeah, I suppose we can start with the situation in Lebanon, given that this is where my default home is during this period. Well, for anyone who's been following the news in Lebanon, it's been a tinderbox waiting to erupt, in the sense that there have been there's a huge economic crisis at the moment. There has been one for a while, and there were protests since last October, which were billed as the October Revolution. And so that actually came to a standstill due to the pandemic. So it's quite interesting that while Lebanon did really well with curbing COVID-19, the economic impact of it has meant that the social safety net is much more fragile. We're expecting many more people to fall under or the poverty line. And there has actually been no resolution. The Lebanese lira, we have a double currency here, the dollar and the lira has fallen to 60% of its value, and it's been pegged to the dollar for quite some time now. And it's like a lot of other developing countries where this peg has been artificial. So it was unsustainable, and somehow this has echoes with other parts of the world where we have parallel crises going on right now, right? I mean, there's the pandemic itself and the direct health impacts, but there are also socioeconomic and political crises going on in many parts of the world. And when I look at my various homes over the time, India, of course, is the original home. It's going through its own fair share of it's reeling under the effects of the lockdown, because a majority of India simply cannot do social isolation, cannot afford even, letting one day of work go by, because the food rations are about, there are huge food shortages, in the sense that most migrant workers have about one day's worth of rations. So we're talking about an extremely precarious situation. And then there's the US, where you are, which was home for 5 years. I was among the lucky migrants who was able to get a green card. And so it also I happened to have the nationality. And you've seen the divides, social, economic, political, and just, really terrible leadership. We can't put it in any other words between Modi and Trump. So it's Lebanon somehow sits somewhere in between, sensible about the pandemic itself, but extremely reckless with the economy, and just really lagging in terms of any resolution. There is a need for a bailout, but we don't really see anything being approved by the IMF.
So, one of the things I really wanted to talk about today is you've done extensive work reporting on refugee flows, migrant flows, and laborers. And one of the stories that I often find erased, correct me if I'm wrong, is also the story of these vast refugees who have been fleeing the immense violence in the last few years. I was wondering if you can kind of talk to us again in relationship to the reporting that you've done. How does this population how is this population affected by COVID, the series of lockdowns, and not to mention authoritarian regimes and strongmen across the region, whether it's India, whether it is Modi, whether it is Trump, whether it's Erdogan, or in Hungary, where you have another right wing party coming?
Where basically, Viktor Orban spell the death knell of democracy. I mean, it's pretty shocking. And this has been happening across the board and not just in countries where we're used to this sort of news. So it's a really important point that you bring up. And there's a huge coverage gap as far as refugee communities are concerned. Here in Lebanon, I think one of the ways of curbing the pandemic was simply for NGO workers not to enter these densely populated areas, because obviously the virus did not start within these communities. So if they're kept isolated, it means that there is less risk of contagion, and they're very densely populated communities. So it would be, the impact would be right away. But it tells us something else as well. The fact that they're so isolated that it was so easy to keep them isolated. And this is what we're facing across the globe, that there is this ghettoization or warehousing of refugees. And actually, the reason they haven't been affected by it is exactly because of this social exclusion. But what I've been looking at as well is, I started my coverage with what you would call conflict-driven refugees, displaced communities. But we're starting to see that the term displacement itself and who we consider a legitimate asylum seeker really comes into question with this pandemic, because there's so much internal displacement going on as a result of this disease, that these artificial distinctions that the humanitarian sector poses. And I've worked for these NGOs as a humanitarian worker, where, we have these black and white distinctions between an economic migrant, a conflict-driven refugee, and now we're trying to figure out climate change-driven populations. And I think we're really failing to include the economy within our humanitarian reaction. So as a result, both groups, what we call economic migrants, especially in the States, and that, the administration right now stigmatizes and returns without any issues, are artificially, made separate from refugees. And then refugees are given humanitarian protection, but they're rarely ever given the opportunity to become economically independent. So you're keeping both populations desperate, and they're rendered destitute after about 7 years of being displaced, like the Syrian refugee populations now. So I've started to kind of, I'm trying to dispel that artificial distinctions. We need to, let me use somebody's words that I really admire, Ishim Membe, who's a Cameroonian by birth, but lived in South Africa for a major part of his life. And he said, we need reanimation. And he was talking in a lecture series where he said, basically, he was talking about regional migration, and that we need to, within Southern Africa, that there needs to be new thinking about how we treat our migrant workers. And so I think across the board, within regions, within countries, across the borders of countries, we're having to really rethink what a migrant means, what an asylum seeker means, and how do we, tackle this in the post-pandemic period, because we have less resources, but we have much more need to take care of these populations.
Preeti, I just have an audience question for you. It's kind of very similar to one of the other questions that I was thinking of asking you. The question asks, do you think journalists are equipped to address the reporting crisis that we have right now? And the person goes on to say, I'm not talking about the gutting of money and resources for journalism, but I'm asking about the actual skills to understand how to report these nuanced stories. Do you think journalism now is anything beyond explainer journalism? That's
No, I think it's an excellent question, and I can't even feign that I have the answer to it. But I can tell you that, just yesterday, I was just talking about this with you. There was a panel to commemorate the World Press Freedom Day, and we were able to convene a number of organizations. I work for a Danish organization that supports independent media voices across the world, and we were in partnership with UNESCO, CPJ, and a number of other members of the coalition, and we were looking at this premise of how do we tell the story most effectively. Of course, we were looking at it from the protection point of view that states, as in governments, need to step up with how much accountability they're taking in terms of protecting the press. So let me start by saying that there has been an increase in attacks against the press. The emergency legislation of the pandemic is definitely being manipulated to arrest, intimidate, and reduce access. So for us to be able to report effectively, we need unrestricted access, because we're talking about reactions to the pandemic, like how well the governments are doing in protecting their citizens, but also parallel effects. Are they taking care of the most vulnerable, but also are they manipulating the legislation? So that is one aspect that we do need to address collectively for reporters to do their job better. But to answer the more direct question, which is, do we have the capacity, the specialization? Well, the media, as you very well know, is indefinitely the worst crisis it has faced in its modern history. We've seen that revenues from advertisements simply do not are no longer able to support the platforms. We've relied overly on them. So in order to get that specialization, for me, the way forward, and personally, that's what I'm trying to engage in, is we need collaborative approach over the competitive approach. So I'm trying to collaborate with specialists, with experts from different fields, not just this field of science, but we're talking about sociology, psychology, anthropology. I think this is the only way we can effectively cover the crisis. And provide a more comprehensive picture. So I hope that at least starts to address the crisis. We knew that this was going to happen, but she's very welcome to join the conversation. This is, I'm sure every parent is aware of this risk. So it's the new workplace hazard. So it's not a problem at all.
She's also kind of she's trying to push boundaries. So it's very interesting for me when, it's very interesting that it's only when I have conversations with other women that she kind of comes in and she wants attention. And when I have these interview men, or if I'm having conversations with others, she's just like, she doesn't care. I don't know if there's a gendered lens to this.
That's really interesting. All right. Well, she's welcome to give us her feedback as she
She's just going
seems
around
fit.
turning the lights everywhere. So if you see a lot of lights going on and off, that also kind of brings us to a conversation that we've been having for almost 2 years now about the new ways in which you want to think about journalism, the ways in which you want to pioneer new ways. I know that I know this really well because we've had these conversations, but I would love to kind of hear from you if COVID has kind of changed some of those ideas, or it's only strengthened the belief that you've already had about how we do need to make those changes.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this in the sense that while I'm not working with media groups to actually work on their own development and sort of strengthening their voices, I also work as a freelancer. And I'm one of those freelancers who would never be able to financially support themselves because I'm slow. I really take my time with my stories. And hence I have this, sort of bread and butter, which is somehow linked. So to be honest, I felt that I've been in that situation of privilege where at the organization where I work, we've actually been, we've hunkered down and we've started to really look at other formulas of journalism, kind of showcasing the best examples of what some of our media partners across the globe are doing. And what we found is that a lot of our partners, just like yourself, are used to working. Their default is emergency mode, right? While most of us are sort of clamoring about and trying to adapt to this new world, this is the premise under which they operate. So I've been learning an incredible amount of, it's been a steep learning curve. And what has changed for me definitely is being more active, because I've been really looking forward to engaging in conversations with you, and this is a great way of doing it. But also with any platform that I think is actually advancing the conversations about how we can better cover the story. The big change for me is that I've realized that my bread and butter, as in my income, and work that I'm most passionate about are not necessarily going to correlate. And that is okay, because I'm still in a privileged enough situation where I can be on the editorial board of a publication. And that's the thing that I'm most passionate about, let's say, but it pays nothing. This is the transition situation that we're facing. So I wanted to do something active, and I joined the editorial board of Stories Asia, which is one of the largest collectives of independent journalists in that particular region in South Asia. And they've been doing an incredible job in covering daily stories, dispatches from kind of the front lines of this pandemic from across India. And you know, the terrain, well, it is so diverse in terms of capacities and results. I mean, from Kerala being this, optimal situation to, Delhi as the capital not doing that well. And so these are basically first drafts of history, right? And I've been kind of trying to write a piece about that. And it's great to sit on the sidelines and watch them get their content together and make sure that it looks as good as possible, or to help get it to an international audience. So these are some of the things that I've done personally. I think it's been a massive change. It's been 8 weeks of total lockdown in Beirut, so it's only the last 2 days that we started opening up. So I had a lot of time on my own because I ended up here because I was in a work project. And so I've had this time to actually sort of reanimate or, innovate. And I hope to continue that over the coming period.
We have another audience question. Again, this goes back to questions of journalism. It talks about, how do we train a new generation of journalists to do the first draft of history really well? I think they just tried it. Because first drafts, and this person says, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out what they're saying.
Sure. I was doing the same yesterday. So I get it.
So they're saying that as a historian, the first drafts of history are absolutely important for the function of recording what happened. So how do we train journalists to do the better first drafts of history? What should we be teaching them? Is it skills, or is it knowledge, or is it empathy, or is it a bit of all three?
I think that's, again, a really good question, and it almost answers its premise, in the sense that it's definitely a combination of all of them. But a lot of times I've found that empathy is key, and knowing where the story is key. And so what I've found is collaborating with community reporters. And when I mean community reporters who might have done a lot of international stories, but they are from those places and they're intimately connected to these issues. I see that they're able to deliver in an emergency situation a really well-phrased, well-contextualized story that has both the emotive, kind of why should I care about this premise, but also is able to gather all of the other contextual knowledge that we need to say, okay, what went right here? What went wrong? Was there corruption? They know the story really well in a way that no journalist who's parachuted in can. And if you think about it, in terms of modern history, I can't think about another situation where we have had as little access. It doesn't matter if you're a media giant like Al Jazeera English or whoever else. For at least a part of this pandemic, we weren't able to go into these, diverse communities and just, report the story on cushy budgets. That just wasn't a possibility. So I think, again, this period amplifies the need for us to collaborate on different levels, media of different sizes, of different specializations, and also collaborations between, research organizations, universities, some of the government, institutes where you can actually trust them in progressive countries like in Scandinavia. I think we need so much more of this in moving forward. Collaborative, collective journalism is what I was thinking. And if I can quickly wrap that thought up with actually Ida Wells, who was, honored by the Pulitzer Center, and she was this pioneering investigative journalist, born a slave and fought all her life for her rights and those of millions of others, and she was part of a collective, and she always believed in cooperatives, and that was a thing for a while. And I'm actually only starting to research this, so I don't have the answer. Why did that not evolve, and can we get back to that? Because I don't think we need to operate as these media giants anymore. I don't think we can. We need to find a new formula. I mean, we're learning to re-engage through new portals. This is a new portal. And I've been kind of obsessed with that word portal since Arundhati Roy
I
used
know
it. It
that
just
you.
kind of creeps into my vocabulary. So we're finding new ways of engaging. And let's say it's much more frugal. Yesterday, the panel that I had was nothing. It cost nothing. It just cost intellectual resources. Otherwise, maybe it would have been a large gathering that would have cost, let's say, $100,000 up to that amount, depending on who's invited. So we need to innovate.
And that kind of brings us to this idea of home. Um, Someone who has multiple homes, who's lived in multiple homes. Um, it's this sense of seeing so many of your homes burn at the same time.
Yeah.
But that also comes to this idea that you've been thinking about, this idea of work, rethinking work and engagement. I was wondering if we could kind of like walk us through what you're thinking at this moment.
Sure, I'll start with that concept of no home, which basically, I have to make this disclaimer before I start talking about this context. I've always had the privilege of the flexibility of calling a lot of places home. Both my parents are Indian. I'm from India. I was born in Iran, and then at some point I was fortunate enough to get a US passport, which allows me access to a majority of the world without visa issues and all of that. So it's been a very flexible, choice-based, setup. This has also meant that about 12 countries have been home in the past like 15 years. And that's a lot of places, of course, some with a much, much more presence than others. And Lebanon was one of them. But what has been really interesting was while I have this social safety net, it spread globally and I wasn't able to access most of it. I'm very grateful to have ended up in Lebanon, where I do have very, very dear friends who have checked on me. But it became a situation where the airports closed down really quickly. US was the only place where I could have potentially entered from Lebanon. Let me tell you, the charter flight was about $3,000. It tells you something about, sort of the American approach: fork out the money or you can't get home. It seemed absurd to me to be going to the epicenter. It was starting to become an epicenter, at least New York was, and that's where a lot of my friends are. So it didn't make sense to go to the US. My partner's in Norway, and they shut down their borders really quickly, and so did Lebanon, actually. And he's with his daughter there, so that wasn't an option. My parents are in India, and guess what? India doesn't have dual citizenship, so I'm no longer a citizen, and and they shut the country to so-called outsiders. And so it was a very interesting situation. And then I started to just look around, and I mapped out what I call this like Venn diagram of social vulnerabilities. And I found myself sort of hopping,
Actually,
sort of a hopscotch around it, in the sense that, and of course, everything's amplified, right? I'm still in a very privileged situation, but from the social isolation aspect, the healthcare system here in Lebanon is crumbling. So I didn't dare step out for a while because contagion meant that, there just wasn't capacity. I've been here basically staring at walls for 2 months. And let me tell you, that really does a number on your brain. And thanks to my really good friends and of course, who've been listening to me just kind of go through this, it's Groundhog Day kind of situation. And then and there's also that thing of the single woman. There's a little bit of that pressure. We're still considered outliers in the sense that when you do end up in that situation, people sort of look at you like, yeah, but wasn't that a choice? You chose to be here. And you want to say, no, it's a sequence of events where I prioritize certain things in life, hence I'm here. It's not a fault or no fault situation. So I've also been engaging a lot in those conversations, and I've had extremely, inspiring people in my life. A really dear friend, Paula, who's in New York and who spent 3 weeks in the ER in one of the teaching hospitals, the epicenter of the crisis, really came out of it, kind of even stronger. I have my friend Nasreen, who's been sort of my partner in crime over this time. We decided that if we were going to pass on germs, it was just going to be with each other. So she was there for my walks. I have another friend who's, sort of around and checking on me, who talks about how her clients don't take her time as seriously because she, does not have a child. So there are a lot of these, social discussions to be had. And I'm sorry for that long-winded answer, because that brings me to how do we define community? Because right now we're outliers, but single people who live on their own, like Sweden is an exception, apparently they have an extremely high number, but that's going to increase over time. And so how do we redefine community? And for me, I had to redefine it by saying, okay, I have extra time. Okay, then I'll host some nurses because I have extra space. They're medical workers who are finding it hard to travel from long distances, or I'll spend more time helping other people who are working on emergency projects. And that's what a lot of my friends do. I mean, working in displaced communities here, helping migrant domestic workers in Lebanon who've been extremely vulnerable. And a lot of them, because of the economic crisis, have lost their jobs. And because of the sponsorship system here, they've been displaced overnight. So it's about rediscovering social value, if that makes sense.
I also we have an audience question, but I also kind of wanted to ask this idea of intimacy, right? What happens to intimacy, right? This idea of intimacy as
Yeah.
the person, as someone who's not just as single, people, but even as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
As humans, we are programmed to think about things in terms of feel and touch,
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
hug, an embrace. What
Yeah, absolutely.
what happens to the very idea of I'm not even talking about desire. I'm simply talking about
Yeah. No, absolutely. Because my only friend that I take walks with, I think we actually were able to sort of have some kind of touch, and it was just and it was a really odd feeling. For 8 months, 8 weeks, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. I mean, there's a cat that I, forcefully adopted. That's basically as far as I got it, as far as touch was concerned, and it's super interesting. I mean, I don't know that I've ever experienced more mental pressure as a result of that. And I'm constantly aware that this is something that will come to pass. And of course, it's just been 2 days since places have opened. It's also interesting that, of course, there's that effect it has on you. So it makes you definitely very tense. And I think it tells us something about why, again, I'm trying to apply it to other places. Why prison systems don't work, if we think about it. You can't keep people locked up like that and expect any sort of reform in terms of mentality or approach. So it was a little bit like a house arrest, it definitely sheds new light. But also what I'm very cognizant of is that moving forward, there's a reluctance in me to really engage socially. And I think that is happening to a lot of people, especially older people, if you think about it, where you just kind of get used to the status quo because, you can't have high adrenaline all the time. So you start sort of, it is a little bit of a trauma conflict kind of feeling. So you just kind of get into that frame of mind. So I think we should just be very aware of people around us who might not be going out after all of this is over, and I've had, again, a lot of fantastic people in my life who check in on me all the time. Maybe there's some people who are not as fortunate in this period, and instead of putting the onus on them, I think it should be on us to check in on them.
What about grief? The sense of grief that you see every day, because there's something that I really wanted to ask you. Is For me, grief is an integral part of just getting up every morning and seeing news coming out, whether it is the recent lynchings that happened in Georgia, or just the number of people dying, the absolute callousness of the leaders, whether it is Trump or Modi. I'm just grieving all the time, and I don't know what to do with this grief. And I was wondering if these are some of the things that you've thought about, or I'm sure everybody's feeling it. It's just that feeling grief is different than actually grieving.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. there's been a sort of dissonance, at least in my head, because I'm surrounded by absolute silence every day. I've never heard the street as quiet. You know, Lebanese are very social and you always hear somebody, but everything went quiet. And against that backdrop, when you're working with media related stuff and when you're looking at news every day, you just see lives that are being, affected by the day. And, for you, you've experienced it in New York, sitting at home and knowing that so many people, are undergoing basically life-threatening situations and dying on a daily basis. Looking at my friends in Italy and, just thinking, did I forget someone, and constantly thinking, oh my God, how about that person? I haven't seen them in social media. So what I tried to do was do my best to structure my days. And so every time I grieved about something, I tried to think, what can I do my little infinitesimal part? What can I do to change the status quo or to change the conversation? And really, I took a lot of individual initiatives, as I said, like hosting someone or checking in on people or joining a collective or just arranging conversations that were overdue, and writing a lot and producing material and helping media. Really, that's been very satisfying for me, doing a lot of brainstorming on what kind of solutions based approach can we have. Can we think 3 steps ahead? What should we be looking at? What are the issues? How are women affected? Are we getting enough coverage here? And when I say working with a lot of media partners, I mean independent media in Lebanon, Philippines, Myanmar, wherever else my organization works with. And, we also launched a few advocacy campaigns. So it was actually grief filtered somehow, because I had the privilege of being bored. I have the privilege of just staring at, I've had a lot of time staring at these walls. I know the cracks and the details so well at this point. So I just took my time every single day. And when I had difficulties, I reached out to people, but just really documented thoughts, and I've looked at people like you and I've just been inspired and thought, look at her, she's doing it every day, and she's still taking care of her family, and she's surrounded by probably her paying work as well.
Point
So,
is it's I've just felt so absolutely incompetent and bad at everything. I think I was having a conversation with Bhakti as well, and I just feel that I'm constantly just doing things and I'm doing them really badly, right? I'm also in the epicenter's epicenter. I'm in New York. I have a 3-year-old
mm,
who is just too smart and too full of energy to contain. But more importantly, I have friends who are going through some very remarkable things. And of course, the communities that we work with that are going through some of the worst state mandated violence.
mm,
So I don't know, I just feel like this is this constant sense of just being overwhelmed and not doing anything well. But as you
yeah.
said, I'm just absolutely blessed to have a remarkable group of people around me all the time. But again, I
Mm,
understand that's a privilege and it's not something that happens every day. Um,
sure.
as we come to the end, towards the end, we have one more audience question.
Mhm.
Question says, "What is the one thing that is absolutely changed for you, and what is the
Mm.
thing that will never happen again? You can't." So they're trying to say about that one thing perhaps is not going to be the same after COVID or once COVID, if a post COVID world exists.
I think for me, what has changed is, and maybe it resonates with you, we grew up with this idea, with obsession among developing countries with GDP, this gross domestic product, and like that as an indicator of success and progress. One thing that I will spend the rest of my life trying to sort of communicate is that until we have social protection for the majority, we are not a developing country. We're a country in stagnation, whether it's Lebanon or India or anywhere else. I think it really etched that in my mind in a way that no other event has. And you mentioned grief. I think all of us are grieving about this in one way or another, feeling helpless, knowing that, there are people who are able to isolate with so much space, and then there are others who just, who do not have one meal's worth of saving. And it's just incredible that we're still living in that kind of, experiencing those levels of inequality. So we should take advantage of this momentum, and turn this grief and rage. We should be raging, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And turn that into collective introspection. I don't want to let go of this momentum. I feel energized by it. I've never been woken up from slumber like this. As much as I've worked on all of these issues, this pandemic is a historic event in my life that is going to affect every issue that I work on, and also in my personal life in terms of how I view love and the importance of, as you said, intimacy and really who your people are. It really tells you a lot about that. And I think on a personal level, every one of us across the globe would have experienced that. So I hope that it's relatable to the person who asked the question as well.
No, I think I also see the sense of rage transferring into actual political possibilities, and these are all women. Every woman I talk to is angry, and every man I talk to is resigned himself. It's it could also be my own selection bias, but every woman I talk to is angry, and I feel
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And sorry to just to add to that, but they've also been very kind of pragmatic and sensible. I think it's a little bit of what I said about independent media. The default mode is emergency. We're good at multitasking. We've had to do that. We've had shittier pay, if that, in comparison. We're used to inequalities. We're used to social injustices. It's almost like we're wired over generations to react to it. And you see women leadership, whether it's in Scandinavia or whether it's across the globe in New Zealand, women leaders are doing really well because they're calm under these situations. Not to take away from the ability of men at all. There are like absolutely wonderful men supporting me, but this is also a time where I think we can see what leadership, when it's really equal, what the result can be. So I agree with you that you can see the gender differences, absolutely.
Preeti, thank you so much for joining us.
My
And
pleasure.
I think
I think, yeah, that's basically the end of the session, isn't it?
it does. Yes, Mama's here.
Hello there.
Mommy, Dad, put my worksheet in there. Preeti, thank you so much. And I will talk to you
See you
soon.
soon.
And that's
We'll keep talking about it. Goodbye, dear. Bye.